Thank you very much. Welcome councillors, welcome officers, and welcome members of the public who may be watching us. This is Monday the 6th of December, and it is the Standards and Regulatory Purposes Committee. I'm John Ward, I'll be chairing it, and you'll doubtless get introduced to the members as and when they speak. Item 1 is minutes of the last meeting. Does anybody have any difficulties with factual matters in the minutes, or may I sign them at the end of the meeting? Thank you very much. Item 2, apologies for absence. Georgina?
We have apologies from Councillor Peter Marriott and from co-optee Stephen Reynolds.
Thank you very much. And disclosures of interest, any in advance of the meeting?
None received.
Thank you very much. Any last minute ones at the meeting? Right, thank you very much. None recorded. Questions by members of the public and questions by members of the council. Do we have either?
None received.
Thank you very much. So we will move to item 6, arrangements for dealing with code of conduct, which I believe is going to be introduced by the monitoring officer from afar.
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies, I can't be with you this evening in the chamber. Item 6 begins on page 5 of your papers. I hope the report is fairly self-explanatory, but I will say a few words of introduction. You considered a set of proposed changes to the council's published arrangements for dealing with standards allegations against councillors and co-opted members earlier in the year. The committee was broadly supportive at that point of the proposed changes, but you did ask me to go away and consult further with town and parish councils and also with our appointed independent persons. So as well as writing to the town and parish councils and also to that pool of independent persons, I attended the most recent Borough Council Town and Parish Liaison meeting to talk through the proposals and hear feedback. So the consultation has been helpful. There was general support from those consulted. There were 2 areas of feedback that I'd like to walk you through. The first was a suggestion in the original set of proposals that complaints about town or parish councillors should only be considered by me if the town or parish clerk had been unable to resolve them locally within 28 days. And secondly, there were a number of comments about the tone of the arrangements. One of our independent persons fed back to me he felt it was odd that the arrangements addressed the complainant directly rather than adopting a more neutral voice. So on that first point about the town and parish role, there was definitely a split amongst consultees. Some town and parish councils are very keen on the idea that it should be possible to resolve issues at a local level without immediately resorting to a formal borough process. However, others fed back strongly to me that such issues should remain squarely with me as monitoring officer. It was never my intention to force any process on town and parish councils, but it was my intention to ensure that they weren't excluded. So what your papers contain is a revised proposal at paragraph 3.6 on page 15 of your papers, which hopefully makes it clear that I would only refer a matter back to a town or parish council with the clerk's consent. The intention here is therefore to make sure that town or parish councils have the opportunity to get involved, but they're not forced to do so every time if that's not appropriate. And on the second point of feedback around the neutral voice or lack of it, on reflection, I agreed that the arrangement should have a neutral voice rather than address either the complainant or the subject member. So I've gone through the arrangements as they are and as proposed to try and make the voice in every case a neutral one. And whilst reviewing the proposed changes and at the request of you, Chairman, I've also sought to remove the terminology of a valid complaint, as this has in the past and can be confused with a complaint that is upheld, which of course isn't the same thing. So instead, the arrangements would now refer throughout to complaints that will or will not be considered under these arrangements. And that's all I was going to say. Thank you, Chairman. I'm happy to pick up any questions.
Committee members go first. Councillor Cosser.
I've a number of points, Chairman, if I can go through them. The first one is I wanted to ask a question about the order of the document. It just seemed a little strange to me to have an executive summary at the start, because I think for those who know what they're doing and know what they want to find out, they'll probably find the executive summary quite quickly. For the uninitiated who genuinely want to understand what this is about, it seemed to me to be more logical that the preamble would go first. And just to illustrate that, if you look at the executive summary, I was reading through it, and then I find a reference for the first time in paragraph 5 to code. Later on in 9, it says code of conduct. I think that needs to be looked at anyway, but it's not actually clear what any of these things are. So the first point I'd like to make for consideration of the monitoring officer and the committee is whether we all actually have the preamble first, so people actually understand what this document is and so on before we get to an executive summary. That was my first point. My second point is I'd just like to say something about the position with the town and parish councils. As some of you will know, I do chair the Surrey Association of Towns and Parishes and the Surrey Association of Local Councils, and I have been quite heavily lobbied on this. I think I just wanted to say that I think the monitoring officer in his report has actually got this right, but I did actually get strongly lobbied by those who felt really concerned that if sometimes there were really quite significant disputes in their own council, it was very important for the clerk to be seen to remain neutral in all of that and not in any way to be involved. So I think the proposal that we have that does allow an opportunity, if someone really wants to take that up, to try and sort it out at that level, and good luck to them, that should be given. But it stresses that the important point is that it is the monitoring officer who takes that decision, and that discussion is confidential. But I wanted the committee to be aware that there is some quite significant concern amongst some of the clerks about all of that. The next point I had is I'm just trying to find the bit in the, I think it's 4.49, if I can find it. Sorry, it's difficult finding. Is it 9 or is it G? No, it's, oh, hold on. Yeah, I've got one at, yeah, sorry, a question. 4.9 C. These are the circumstances in which it might not be possible to it might be possible to withhold the complainant's identity. One of them is works closely with the councillor they are complaining about. I'd like some clarification as to whether that includes a fellow councillor, because I think some of the most difficult and awkward of these complaints are where a councillor wants to complain about another councillor, and it may be considered, and I know the monitoring officer has this within their brief to look at this, you know, vexatious, and it's quite difficult if a complaint is made against you and it is from another councillor and you have no opportunity to know what the context is. So I'd just like some clarification, if I can, Chairman, on what that is about. The next one I wanted to raise is in 4.4G, where it talks about the types of complaints that will not be considered. And it says complaints which relate to, sorry, where is it? Yeah, complaints, yeah, where a councillor has, I'm trying to find the bit now, it's where the councillor is no longer a councillor, basically. The question I wanted to ask is, at what point does that kick in? If a complaint is received against a councillor and the councillor decides at some point in the process that they wish, for whatever reason, to resign as a councillor, is that complaint then simply halted, or because the complaint has started, does the complaint then have to go forward to its conclusion? I can envisage circumstances in which that might happen, so I'd like some clarification on that as well, if I might. I'm getting towards the end, I think, Chairman. Yeah, sorry, 6, yes, some of this is just stuff where it doesn't make much sense, actually. If I can work my way through it, I've got notes. In 6, oh yeah, sorry, it's clearly something that's gone wrong with the drafting. At the end of the intro to 11 on the complaints, from a majority of all the councillors of council, I mean, clearly the drafting's just gone wrong and that needs to be put right. And on 11.2, could I make a suggestion for a change here? It talks about an officer of a parish council. That should either say a town or parish council, or it should say a local council. Otherwise, it excludes town councils. I think that's it for now, Chairman. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Councillor Cosser. I will throw that probably straight to the monitoring officer. I'm glad you are content with the way he has dealt with the town and parish councils, because I know there was a lot of concern about that, and I think particularly in the smaller councils where people are much more close to each other in their normal living, that was going to cause a certain amount of difficulty. However, Robin, I've jotted down the things, as I'm sure you have. Most of them, I think, are administrative rather than anything else. So if I can throw that back to you for clarification, please.
Thank you, Chairman. In terms of the executive summary, absolutely happy to either have it up front or somewhere else in the document. As Councillor Cosser says, it may make more sense to have it after the preamble. So, you know, whatever the will of the committee on that point, I'm happy to go with that, of course. On the town and parish point, then yes, Councillor Cosser is absolutely correct. There was some strength of feeling around this. I mean, I suppose the point I would want to make is that I think the error was there in the drafting, not in the intent. The intent was there to make sure that town and parish councils had the opportunity to be involved and that they wouldn't be bypassed when they didn't want to be. I don't think that the drafting covered that properly. And so, you know, hopefully we're now back to the original intent with better drafting. I do think it's important to say there wasn't any intention, if you like, on pushing the responsibility unduly towards town and parish councils, because I absolutely agree that isn't what we should be doing. In terms of 4.9 little c, so yes, that could refer to councillor to councillor. I mean, I have to say, Chairman and Councillor Cosser, in terms of how that's been drafted, I was certainly thinking more of officers than I was of councillors, but the same could apply in terms of a councillor complaint about another councillor. The only thing I would want to say in that respect is just to remind you of paragraph 3.4, which is a proposed change, where a complaint concerns an issue between two Waverley Borough councillors. The monitoring officer will initially refer the matter to the appropriate group leaders or group leader to resolve amongst themselves if at all possible. Every effort should be made to resolve the matter within 28 days, etc., etc. So Councillor Cosser is entirely correct to raise this question of councillor to councillor complaints. And, you know, if I do feel that, and if I judge that it's vexatious, obviously vexatious, then that will be a reason for excluding the complaint up front. But that is something that I would do in consultation with the group leader. In terms of paragraph 4.4 and the reference to when there's somebody who's no longer a councillor, well, that paragraph is there to give some criteria around the decision that I'm making up front when a complaint is first submitted, to decide whether or not to accept it into these arrangements. So by definition, really, it's that criteria is only applying at that point most strongly. However, there's a judgment to be made if I accept a complaint and during the course of dealing with the complaint, that councillor resigns. On a very practical level, they are no longer bound by the councillor code. Once they're no longer a councillor, it doesn't mean that the concern has gone away, and there's a judgment to be made by me at that point as to whether or not any element of the investigation is made public, or whether it's, you know, whether it's the right thing to do to simply close the case at that point. But what is absolutely the case is that once a councillor is no longer a councillor, they can't be required, for example, to attend a hearing, and they are not anymore duty bound by the code of conduct. But of course they were at the point that the complaint was put in. I hope that's helpful.
Are you okay?
Could I just come back to your, I understand your point about referring me to 3.4, but that refers to what happens when the councillors are Waverley councillors. what happens then when they are town or parish councillors? Because that instance of group leaders and so on is not going to work in most town and parish councils. So there is no backup in a sense in that context. So, you know, for the towns and parishes, that does take me back to my original question. That was the that was my first one I was concerned about. On the other one, for what it's worth, I think my own view, but it may not be the view of this committee, is that if a councillor should resign in that process, I'm not even sure it's appropriate or necessary for you to need to take that judgment for some of the reasons you've described, and I think others. I think it would be sensible to put something in a code that suggests that at that point that the complaint will not be pursued. I mean, that may well be one of the reasons that I don't want to hypothesize lots of different situations, but it just seems the logical thing to do to me, and I'd at least like to see whether other members of the committee support that view as well. But thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cosser. Before I bring you in, Robin, I will ask if any other members of the committee wish to speak. Peter?
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, I believe we should have as much flexibility as possible. And I think sometimes town clerks feel rather exposed. They're by themselves, they have just a few staff around them, but they are making decisions. And I think when it comes to dealing with councillors, I think it depends very much upon the subject and the person involved. So I think if they can either sort the problem out themselves, that's fine. But if they feel they would like the monitoring officer to be involved, then I think that it's very important that the monitoring officer is involved.
Thank you. Any more comments? Councillor Gale.
Sorry, I'm very new to this, so I'm just reading through all these things. But when Robin actually just referred to 4.9 little c, there are 4.9 little c's 3 times. Should the document be changed so that there are c's, little i's and things like that, rather than all being 4.9 and then 8 or whatever? Could be confusing.
Fine. As far as sort of typos and formatting are concerned, we'll leave that with the monitoring officer to fix, shall we? Yep. Okay. Anyone else? Please.
Hello, Thomas Hughes, Bramley Parish Councillor. I just have, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a point of clarification about section 4.4, page 15, which I think we've covered a little bit in the past, but it says the following types of complaints will not be considered under these arrangements. So where some of the points below are seen as serious points and possibly a breach of code, will they be considered in another procedure? For example, one of the examples, complaints which relate to a decision of an employee or a committee. There is potentially bias sometimes or some other interests that may influence that decision. So if that decision is found by somebody to be unfair, how would they raise a complaint under this process, or would that go to a borough or other type of complaint procedure?
Okay, I think I know the answer to that, but I'm not going to be brave enough to tell you it. I'll throw that back to Robin.
Thank you, Chairman. So in to take that point first, the arrangements are there squarely to consider any allegation of a breach of the code of conduct. So if we're looking at something which isn't an allegation of a breach of the code of conduct, it shouldn't be being considered under these arrangements. There are quite a few cases where an element of someone's complaint might allege a breach of the code of conduct, but other elements of their complaint have to be dealt with under a different process. So the other processes that might be engaged might be the Borough Council's corporate complaints process. It might be the town or parish council's own complaints process, or simply dealing with that complaint when it comes in. It may be an employment matter, which would be dealt with by the town or parish council and potentially by the town and parish councils association. So there's various other processes that might be engaged, and this process is there when there's been an alleged breach of the code of conduct. I hope that answers that question. Do you want me to pick up the other points that were made, Chairman, at this point?
If you could sort of clear the slate, and then I'll write some more on it for you.
Okay, thank you. So on Councillor Gale's point, yes, I agree. I think there's formatting changes need to be made. I agree with Councillor Nicholson's feedback, and I think that reinforces the point around the flexibility that needs to be there around the town and parish councils. On Councillor Cosser's point around the group leader mechanism not working at a town and parish level. That's of course correct. So the original intention was to have these kind of mirroring clauses within these new arrangements. At a borough level, it was to say, you know, perhaps something before it gets considered by me ought to be considered by the relevant group leader. And at the town and parish level, the bit that we've just been talking through is supposed to apply there. So, you know, it's for me to refer it back to the town clerk or the parish clerk. And in some situations, quite a few situations, in reality, what I'm doing there is speaking to the town or parish clerk and immediately getting particular, you know, members involved. It might be the chairman of the parish council that I'm getting involved, or it might be another councillor to deal with the matter informally, because, you know, clearly that group mechanism does not always apply at a town or parish level, and we wouldn't expect it to.
Okay, thank you, Robin. I have the Vice Chairman and then Councillor Gray.
Thank you, Chairman. The point that's been raised about what happens when a councillor retires, resigns, or is no longer a councillor. Of course, the other thing that will happen once they cease being a councillor is that none of the sanctions, that limited sanctions that this borough has, wouldn't apply, because nothing would apply. So if you went all through the whole works and then came to say, right, this councillor will be barred from attending meetings for a couple of weeks, or he won't be allowed to do this, I mean, there's no financial penalty or anything else that can be imposed. It seems to me that once a councillor retires, resigns, or is no longer a councillor, then the process should stop forthwith. And whether that can be written in or something, but it does seem to me that that should be an automatic thing. The second thing I wanted to raise was, we've been talking about putting a preamble in. Could I be clear as to which paragraphs of this document we consider to be a preamble? Is it paragraphs 1 and 2 under context? Or is that what is intended? Just so it's quite clear, because I can see that that is paragraphs 1 and 2 would be quite sensible to have at the start. Thank you.
Monitoring Officer, I'll let you fire on that one while Councillor Gray devises another question for you.
Thank you. Yes, I think for me, I assumed that the preamble was probably paragraphs 1, 2, and 3, but it may be helpful to hear from Councillor Cosser as to what he thought the preamble was when he was making that point. Can I just pick up, Chairman, on this question again of what happens if a councillor resigns? So the reason I just want to come back on that is that learning from best practice and some of the learning and research I've done on this, there are situations where the resignation of a councillor clearly means the whole thing stops. And in some respects, it absolutely does, because they're no longer bound by the code. The sanctions can no longer apply, etc., etc. So Councillor Goodridge is entirely correct. I suppose I want to make a couple of points. One is that in the current standards process that we have, that we're applying here, the sanctions in many ways are the weakest part of it. We don't have huge scope for sanctions, and that's a matter of debate, obviously, as to whether they should be strengthened. But the majority of the process is around bringing something into the light, particularly if it goes all the way to hearing, and holding councillors publicly accountable, individually and collectively, for the standards of conduct that they demonstrate. And so the learning from some other councils, often those who've had particularly acute issues around conduct, has been that there are situations where it can be appropriate, even if a councillor has resigned, that maybe the issue raised relates to organisational culture, or it relates to something which is clearly so acute or so concerning that it's in the public interest for there to be some sort of public resolution of that, rather than, for example, just as a simple example, it might be that the outcome of a standards process is that training is required for a number of councillors. It wouldn't be right, it seems to me, to suddenly say that training is no longer required simply because the 1 or 2 councillors who were the subject members of a complaint had then resigned, because it may be that there's a bigger cultural issue there. So in general, I agree with all of the councillors who are saying once that subject member has resigned, it's likely the process will stop. Yes, it is likely the process will stop, but I wouldn't want to write it into these arrangements as an absolutely automatic clause to say that the process stops, because I can envisage situations where it shouldn't.
Okay, thank you, Monitoring Officer. Yes, I mean, when we were talking about that, I think it was certainly I wrote down the word versatility, and someone else mentioned flexibility. I have a great trust, Monitoring Officer, that you will not unnecessarily increase your own workload, and would be more than glad to see the back of anything that could terminate with a councillor leaving us. But for the moment, I think committee, if we could allow the Monitoring Officer that flexibility for the moment, rather than prohibit him from doing something which he feels may on, I hope, the very, very odd occasion be necessary. Can we go with that with the Monitoring Officer, please? Nobody said no, so I'll take it quickly. Councillor Gray.
Thank you. If I could just pick up on that same issue, I was a bit concerned that we were going to leave it, and wanted to ask the Monitoring Officer to consider the people with dual roles. So let's assume we've got a parish councillor and a borough councillor, right, where they've got two roles, but they resign one. I think that you've got to be a bit careful in those circumstances, because it may be that it's still appropriate to continue because he's got a public office. So that was one point. And the second point is, I think it's quite difficult to pursue somebody when it's resigned. And I think that if you are going to give the Monitoring Officer flexibility, then it should be something of a more general nature. If there's a point of principle or a point that is broader, then okay, then he should have discretion to continue. But if it's about an individual's behavior, I cannot see how you can continue. You're wasting your time, continue a process with that person. And the second point I had was a little confusion over the code. It says in here, if it's not covered by this code. So that means that a parish council that has a slightly different code of conduct, it couldn't be administered under this, or is that the case? Or is it the case that we are going to ask all the parish councils and town councils to adopt the Waverley process if our Monitoring Officer is actually going to adjudicate? So that's a question on that. And one very small point, I find it quite difficult on 4.4. I think it's, I have another councillor's problem trying to work out which paragraph it is. I think it's G, and it says more than 23 months. I find that strange. It seems to have some history, but why 23 months? Why not 12 months? Why not 18 months? It seems that there's a cycle here in terms of council and council years, but something that's 23-month old is an extremely old complaint. So if I could just raise that with you, through you, Chair.
I think it's one number has been struck out and the other one's been superimposed, but I'll let the Monitoring Officer answer that.
Well, just a clarification, I can't see what's been proposed. I can see 23 is underlined. It looks to me. Oh, okay, thank you. I bow to my more intelligent colleagues here.
Monitoring Officer, was there anything you wanted to comment on that?
Certainly on the 23, it's correct that the 2 has been struck through and replaced with the 3, but it is difficult to read. So that will read more than 3 months, is what we're proposing that it says. Can I pick up on the point around 2 points, connected points around double and triple hatters and resignations? I think that the key thing to say there is that when I receive a complaint, so first thing to say is that councillors are required to abide by their local code of conduct. So if you have somebody who, for example, is a Waverley Borough councillor and a town councillor, let's say a Godalming town councillor, they have 2 codes of conduct to abide by. One is the Waverley Code of Conduct, and the second is the Godalming Town Council Code of Conduct. Now, in general, we advise town and parish councils to adopt the same code of conduct the Borough Council adopts. And at the moment, as you know, the Waverley Borough Council has adopted the LGA model code, and I expect a number of other councils, town and parish councils, to adopt the same. So it may be that the codes are in fact have the same content within them, but they are separate codes. So that, I hope, answers also the point about what would happen if a councillor resigned from one of their hats but not from the other. The question will become, well, whether it was their town council or their borough council membership, which was the issue in the first place. So I would never get into investigating a complaint before having established exactly whether or not the complaint is about them in their capacity as a borough councillor or whether it's in their capacity as a town or parish councillor. I hope that answers that point.
Mr. Chairman, if I just could come back,
Please do.
I left one point off. It would help considerably for people like myself in terms of this document if we had some form of glossary. If we took the major key points out and we actually spelt that out, I think it would help considerably, including sort of emphasising this sort of point, which code it is and how that gets interpreted. A very small glossary, you don't need to include all of them, but it would help. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gray. Monitoring officer, I had a few points I wanted to comment on and a couple of questions. Firstly, referring things to the group leaders, I think is a very good and a decent step forward, and hopefully group leaders could sort a few things out before they got there, because these complaints do take an awful lot of time and energy. I think, you know, if we can get Robin doing other things that are in his job description rather than dealing with complaints by cutting them off at the pass, that would be very useful. So I'm very pleased to see that. As we said earlier, the parish and towns having the ability to sort them out if they want to themselves, but not being in a position where they're sort of forced to, I think is also a good move forward. Page 7, little x at the top there. We have had a number of cases where input from the accused, for want of a better word, has been deliberately delayed or lacking, and I think it's quite good that we should clarify the fact that these investigations will go ahead, and if the person being complained about does not properly cooperate, it will continue to go ahead, because that spills over into previous concerns we've had about the time that these things are taken. And so I wanted to say that I am pleased to see in here some time targets for getting things done as well. Those were largely comments of appreciation, but I do have an interesting question. Page 21 of your agendas. I don't believe, but I would like monitoring officer to correct me if I'm wrong, that we as a council have the ability to strengthen this code. I think national legislation has in fact almost emasculated us and taken away all our powers. But I would like that confirmed for the record, if you could, monitoring officer, or say nay if I've got it wrong. But I do have a question and a thought on 8.8. Excludes the member from the council offices or other premises, with the exception of meeting rooms as necessary for attending council committee or subcommittees. And my question is, if the board says that they want the councillor excluded from all committees, I don't think we can exclude him from council, but he can be removed from all committees. Does this clause mean that he cannot attend committees at all? In other words, if he's been removed from membership, could he still appear asking questions from the councillor gallery rather than the member of the committee gallery? Or would this prohibition from council offices stop him or her coming except for a particular committee of which was probably only the council, except for a particular committee that they remained a member of? I just had a slight concern that if we recommended, or if it was recommended that someone was removed from one or other of the committees, they could still attend, but not as a committee member. So I really wanted to clarify whether that's what we meant, or if they were only allowed to attend such committees as they remained a member of. That's long and torturous, but I think hopefully you understood me.
Yes, I did, Chairman, or I think I did. So the first thing to say is that it's easier to say what you can't do. So no standards process under our arrangements can remove a councillor from office. So therefore, by definition, regardless of whatever else, for example, a hearings panel may recommend, may agree, that the councillor in question will continue to be a councillor. As they continue to be a councillor, they have to be given the ability to join full council meetings, because that is one of the core rights of a councillor. That is how they exercise their democratic representation as a councillor. What this is saying is, sorry, there's a few things, a few strands here really. So that's one thing. The Constitution says that councillors have the right to attend and speak at other committees of which they're not a member. And I mean, unless that was specifically changed, which I don't think we could do, then that right would remain. So there's two things. There's committee membership, and a standards process can lead to a councillor being removed from committees or subcommittees as a member, but they cannot be removed from the committee that is full council. They can be excluded from the premises, except when they are attending as a councillor. And I would see one of those reasons that they would attend as a councillor would be to speak at another committee or subcommittee. So does that clarify? Because I think there's two things going on here. There's one point around having access to the premises, and really that would apply when, you know, there's been a serious breach of conduct, which would mean that it's unacceptable for a councillor to attend the premises unless they are fulfilling their duties as being a councillor. And the second thing is around committee membership. Clearly the 2 points are linked. And if it ever comes to something like that, we would have to be absolutely certain that the council is not going beyond its legal remit. But I would certainly expect that the council could not remove the ability for another councillor to attend and speak at another council's committee or subcommittee, because that right is set out within the Constitution. Whereas the right of a councillor to be a member of a particular committee or subcommittee isn't set out in the Constitution, only in respect of full council.
Thank you, Moderator. I think you've made that quite clear. I was wondering if we could add to that clause at the end something like subcommittees and committees of which he remains a member. I think what you're telling me is that would be against the rest of our Constitution, so maybe we need to look at that during the review. Would that be a reasonable summary?
Yes, Chairman, I don't think we should caveat paragraph 8.8 in that way. I think that would be something to look at. Certainly, it's something I will go away and clarify in my own mind as a result of this meeting, but I don't think there's any need to change the proposed changes, in light of that.
Thank you very much. Anything else from any councillors? Councillor Cosser?
To pick up a couple of points, and then I want to come back with a suggestion as to what we might do about the councillor who wants to resign halfway through, because I'm still not 100% sure that we've got that right yet. First of all, to say on the codes, for what it's worth, you're absolutely right, Chairman, to say that there could be different codes, but in practice, the National Association of Local Councils has adopted the same code as the LGA and has recommended its members to do so. So certainly in the case of the example you gave, and I suspect many others, it will be the same code, but we do have to recognise and reflect in here that it could potentially be different. If I can just talk about this person resigning again, it seems that there might not be the support in the committee for not allowing that discretion as to circumstances. But I think there's a huge difference, and I think Councillor Gray made the point very well, between the situation in which the monitoring officer gave us an example where there are some learning experiences, say for the body corporate about training and things like that, and pursuing a complaint which may hold an individual councillor culpable in circumstances where potentially they have accepted that and have said, okay, I think I probably got this wrong. I've really had enough of this. It's putting a huge burden on me. I'm going to resign, and I expect the matter to cease at that point. I still think we should cease the complaint. There's only there's two possibilities, it seems to me here. We could say that it would normally cease, except, and if the monitoring officer, I haven't got time to do it now, or any of us have, but I could envisage a clause which said, except in those circumstances where there may be wider, but I've got another suggestion. We have in this code circumstances in which the monitoring officer must consult the independent person. And I suspect in the rare case that something like this might happen, it's going to be a very high profile and very contentious case. And I think I would probably be satisfied if we could add in to the top of the executive summary where the independent person must be consulted, where a councillor against whom a complaint is made has resigned in respect of whether the complaint should continue. And I think I'd like to make that proposal, Chairman, if I've got any support for it.
Councillor Gray.
I would like to support Councillor Carter's suggestion there. I think it would meet my concerns.
Anyone else wish to speak on it? Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chairman. I wasn't going to say anything, but having heard this and what you said a few moments ago, of course, you were very accurate, but this has been weakened over the years, some of them when we've both been members of this council. But there was a time, I think, when councillors could even end up losing their house if they'd spent a load of money unnecessarily. But that was weakened by the Labour administration, and then the code was weakened by Tony Blair, and then it was weakened further under the coalition. I can remember Eric Pickles saying, well, it's up to the electorate. If they don't like it, they can get rid of them. And they took virtually all these powers away. So I think we've got to be very careful of giving the monitoring officer a lot to do. And perhaps, with the ending of an investigation when somebody resigns, but just putting in the word normally will end would tie all this up. And okay, people are going to pick hairs over what does normally mean. But I think we can trust the monitoring officer to do that. And I would just suggest the word normally is put in to bring it to an end.
Thank you, Councillor Knowles. We've obviously been on this committee or this council too long together, because I was going to say exactly the same. I think we're spending an awful lot of time, councillors, on a very small, minor and unlikely point, which is a fate of many committees. I would be very happy with Councillor Knowles's point. It gives the monitoring officer flexibility, and it really means that we don't have to sit down here and write 20 paragraphs of when he may and when he may not do things, and we should allow him to go. So I am very much in support of what Councillor Knowles said. Councillor. Thank you very much for your point of order. We will put your suggestion to the vote, but I am commenting on this particular topic, and I think it was a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and I don't think anything here is out of order at all. Does anyone wish to speak to this amendment by Councillors Cosser and Gray? In that case, we will put it to the vote. Could we have those in favour, please? Those against?
That's 4 for and 3 against.
Very well. It is carried. Anything else we wish to comment on, councillors? Right, having passed that amendment, do I have some suggestions from the proposer or seconder as to how the monitoring officer is going to put that into effect?
To clarify, Chairman, I thought the proposal was fairly clear. It is simply to add to the executive summary of arrangements where it says the independent person and must do so before we add in an additional bullet point. Tricky to get exactly the wording right, but what we're effectively saying is must do so before deciding. Must do so before deciding what to do in circumstances where a councillor resigns during the course of an investigation of a complaint. I'm happy if Robin thinks the wording could be better than that, but I think that covers it.
Okay, thank you very much. We will move forward with that. Vice Chairman.
I think it should be very much going to the independent member if the monitoring officer wishes to continue an investigation after a resignation.
That's fine.
In other words, it will normally just finish.
Yes.
But if the monitoring officer wants to carry on, then he must consult the independent member.
I bow to my learned friend.
Should be a little bit more the exception rather than the rule.
Okay, councillors, any other comments on this item? Or can we move to the recommendation that with the amendment that's before us and with the typos and other things that have been picked up in the committee, right. I think the preamble ended up as points 1, 2, and 3. Was that not generally agreed?
It may well be. It wasn't actually what I had in mind, but I'm quite content to leave it at that. I actually thought that the whole context should come before the executive summary, but never mind.
Okay, any final comments from you, monitoring officer, or are you relatively clear what the committee has asked you to do?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I'm clear.
Right, thank you then. So the points you've put in this report are accepted with that change and with the typos and the minor things that we have brought forward. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. Let's move on to item 7, which is constitutional matters, changes to the scheme of delegation. And I think this is again in the hands of the monitoring officer.
Thank you, Chairman. So the proposed amendment follows the consideration of an application by the Eastern Planning Committee in September and a question from Councillor Maxine Gale submitted to full council in October. The current delegated authority is set out within the report at paragraph 4.4. As you'll see, delegation M2 already requires the head of planning and economic development to consult with the relevant planning chairman and ward councillors before agreeing to a section 106 variation. However, paragraph 4.6 in this report sets out the wording of an explicit exception that could be added if this committee were minded to, and to recommend that to full council. As set out, that would be to add a further explicit exception to the existing authority enshrined within the scheme, meaning that the proposed variations that relate to proposed tenure mix of the affordable housing provision could not be agreed under delegated authority. So what's proposed is a further exception to the authority of the head of planning and economic development. Chairman, from my perspective, in its own right, the proposed exception is absolutely logical and certainly does what I think was being hoped for when Councillor Gale put her question in. Clearly, she may want to comment on that. I do have a concern that the effect of various exceptions like this one having been added over time to the scheme means that the scheme of delegation, and in particular this section of the scheme of delegation, is becoming rather complex with its multiple clauses and in particularly its exceptions. I would suggest it's becoming quite hard to read, and sometimes in that respect, perhaps not as transparent as it should be. I suggest the way to deal with that is to use the general constitution review that this committee has already committed to undertaking, and which officers are now looking at. I think that is the best opportunity to stand back and consider what changes, if any, could be made to try and make the scheme, and in particular this section of it, more straightforward and more accessible. So I hope, but as I say, that's for another day. I hope, Chairman, that's clear enough what the proposal is, and I'm happy to answer any questions on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monitoring Officer. I understand the leader wishes to speak on this item.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the committee for reviewing this item at the request of full council. The Monitoring Officer has been through the reason why this has come forward. I would support both the points that he's made, that the general point that having this exception in I think would be a good thing, but also that if we were in the future, as part of the general constitution review, looking at the accessibility and readability of all of the delegated authorities, that would probably help. I'm speaking in support of this particular amendment, this particular change to the scheme of delegation, because of the general principle that it discusses. I would actually not be normally in favour of these sorts of changes based on one particular instance or circumstance, but I do feel, actually, considering the strength of opinion that was issued at Eastern Planning, and also the corporate priorities regarding affordable housing, mean that it's important that if we do see, particularly as we saw at Eastern, a dramatic change in the tenure mix for affordable housing, that it actually should come down to the committee to discuss that and to make appropriate changes should they wish to. That particular Eastern Planning, unanimously, all party threw it out, and with gusto, I would probably add. It wasn't just slightly thrown out. It was very much thrown out, and a number of the members of this committee are also members of Eastern, and it was a joy to behold to watch everybody chuck it out so emphatically. So yes, while I do think this could be a first time of many, so I support the additional delegation, but would equally support the Monitoring Officer's points that we do look at this in the round as part of the constitutional review. So that's all from me, Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Leader. Councillor Gale.
Yeah, I'd like to thank you for actually bringing this into committee for me. It was, as Councillor Follow said, it was 100%. Everyone felt it was wrong. I agree with the Monitoring Officer, though. I think a lot of these things need to be looked at in the round. I would be happy if this is taken forward from tonight, but I think we should look at all the other bits and pieces as well to make it more clear to people. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Does anyone else wish to speak to this item? Councillor Cosser.
Yeah, just very briefly to confirm what both the leader and Councillor Gale have said, and it's a general question that I have, though, really, and that is this: that whereas I don't want lots of long delegations and so on, and the constitutional review is, I agree, the place to deal with this, there is still one thing that concerns me, and that is that it's potentially possible, I think, that this could have somehow slipped through at officer level without people being aware of the sensitivity and so on that members had to something of this kind. And that still worries me. And I think we will go on to debate that during the constitutional review. But can I just clarify that it is possible, and I've always assumed this to be so, but never actually asked the question, that where something is delegated to our officers, that does not prevent them bringing something to an appropriate committee where they consider it appropriate to do so. And the reason I say that is sometimes, with the best will in the world, it will be possible for members and others to send a clear alert to our officers working in cooperation that something that they would normally deal with under delegated authority is likely to cause a major political storm, and they might wish to consider. I'm not suggesting we write it down, but they might wish to consider. But before we go down that road, can I just check that is possible for officers to do that? If they decide not to do it, of course, then we'll see what happens thereafter. But I think it is a helpful situation to have if they can bring it, even though it's delegated.
Thank you, Councillor. I believe that is entirely open to them at the moment, as in the same way it is open to councillors to call in or make their views known. But on the specific point of administration, I'll just get confirmation from the Monitoring Officer that what I'm saying is correct. And then I think Councillor Gale may wish to come back. And then I've got Councillor Gray.
Yes, Chairman, if I understood the point correctly, it's absolutely the case that officers can choose to not exercise their delegated authority and can put the matter back into the committee. You see that happen across various committees. So yes, that's absolutely the case.
Thank you, Monitoring Officer. Councillor Gale, did you want to come back? And then I've got Councillor Gray.
Yeah, just quickly on the matter of how we get to find out about these things. This application was actually on the website. I didn't see it, but a resident in Milford saw it and brought it to my attention. I hadn't been made aware of it. So that's how it came about.
Thank you. Councillor Gray.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was at the Eastern meeting and I was the one of the people who agreed it with, I think, gusto, as the leader said. Partly because this has come up a number of times where Section 106 has changed. And there was a feeling by the committee that wanted all Section 106s should come back to the committee. And I think that would be wrong. I think that, and even at the Eastern meeting, we discussed whether this should come back to the full committee or whether we could delegate it. And I think the right balance was taken. So I would fully support this and I would want it implemented now. I want it would catch something. If when we look at the Constitution, we feel it should be rolled in with a wider thing, then good. But I'd like to see this happen now from my point of view. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other councillor wish to speak? In that case, can I put the recommendation to you that the Standards and General Purposes Committee considers the request to make an exception to the delegation and basically that we agree. Is that agreed? Agreed. Thank you very much. I don't believe there is any other business hiding away in my agenda, but let me just make sure. No. And we certainly don't need to go into exempt. Any other comments from councillors, or would you like to go home? Very well. The meeting is closed at 6.